Harry Truman's justification for using the bomb was that he looked at what it took to take Iwo Jima, what it took to take Okinawa, and realized how many casualties American soldiers, Japanese defending the land it would have taken. So dropping the bomb would end the war much faster. For him, it was the most logical step. Now, in mid-July 1945, the Allied leaders met at Potsdam, which is going to be the last of the conferences. So if we count the Atlantic Conference, and then we go Casablanca, then we go Tehran, then we go Yalta. Here we're at Potsdam, and in this case, it's Harry Truman, not FDR. It's Stalin. It starts with Churchill, but he's going to actually be replaced by a man named Clement Attlee. At the Potsdam Conference, they issue what's known as the Potsdam Declaration. They demand that Japan surrender by August 3rd or face prompt and utter destruction. Now, interestingly, Truman will leave Potsdam really sort of optimistic about post-war relations with the Soviet Union, felt that Stalin was smart and that he could actually deal with him. He'll change his tune very quickly after the war. Now, that deadline of August 3rd passed, and the Japanese did not surrender. So on August 6th, 1945, a B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay took off at 2 a.m. from the island of Tinian and headed for Hiroshima. Just after 8 a.m., flying at about 32,000 feet, the Enola Gay released a 5-ton uranium bomb that was nicknamed Little Boy. Within a minute, the bomb had exploded about 2,000 feet above the ground, and you saw a towering fireball of about 40,000 feet. It killed over 70,000 people, including thousands of Japanese soldiers, and actually there were some American prisoners of war that were killed in the city. Now, what's important is by the end of the war, that death toll would reach 140,000 as people died from injuries and radiation poisoning. Buildings are pretty much all decimated. And now, what's interesting here is that 2 days after the Hiroshima bombing, all of a sudden the Soviet Union, being quite opportunistic and hoping to share in the spoils of victory, sends hundreds of thousands of troops into Japanese-occupied Manchuria along the border between China and the Soviet Union. And Truman and his aides, frustrated by the stubborn refusal of Japanese leaders to surrender, actually, and additionally concerned that the Soviets are going to try to get in on it because they're now so close, they order the second bombing. And in this case, it's going to be called Fat Man. So you had Little Boy and Fat Man. And on August 9th, so again, just 3 days later, the city of Nagasaki, the shipbuilding center, experiences the same nuclear devastation that destroyed Hiroshima. And 5 days later, on August 14th, the Japanese emperor accepted terms of surrender. So really, after the surrender date was passed, 2 bombs, you're going to basically have it all wrapped up in just over a week. Now, when we look back at what happened, this ended the costliest war in history. It was a total war, and its scope was ridiculous in terms of how much money and devastation and death. So almost 50 million civilians and 22 million combatants had died. And the second war was more costly for the United States than any other foreign war. So you just have to take in the fact that it was so catastrophic for the United States. But really, in the end, if you look at the proportion of the population that the United States lost compared to, let's say, the Soviet Union, it was nothing. For every American killed in the war, some 59 Soviets died. And you have to keep that in mind as we're going to be talking about sort of the upcoming grudge between the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, German and Italian fascism, as well as Japanese materialism, are destroyed. The war sets in motion the fall of China to communism in 1949, so even though it's 1945, we got to be looking 4 years ahead. And then the outbreak of the Korean War, which is going to be a sort of proxy war between the Soviets and the Americans. Now, colonial wars in Africa and Asia rapidly crumbled, and you're going to see independence movements that are going to rise up, particularly even in French Indochina, which is going to be the precursor to the Vietnam War. And perhaps most importantly, the Soviet Union emerges from the war as a new global superpower. And the United States is going to be the other major superpower, and it's going to lead to basically 50 years of a Cold War. Now, when you look at the impact on America, particularly on the economy and society, The expansion of the federal government that was prompted by the war continued after 1945, and presidential authority increased enormously at the expense of congressional and state power. So certainly something we saw building during the New Deal, certainly continuing through the war and even after that. We know that the war ended the Great Depression and launched a long, period of unprecedented prosperity and global economic domination. It's not that it's going to immediately start right after the war, but generally speaking, the 50s are considered really, like a 1920s part two, because big businesses grow into gigantic corporations as a result of huge government contractors, military weapons and supplies, new technologies and products that were developed for military purposes like computers, electronics, plastics, synthetics, jet engines, rockets, atomic energy. It all transforms the private sector, as do new consumer products that are generated from war-related innovation. So it's very similar to what happened coming out of World War I into the 1920s, but really at a far more significant scale. You're also going to see that the opportunities that were created for war for women, as well as African Americans and Mexican Americans and other minorities, set up sort of this paradigm where people are going to be demanding change, particularly in the civil rights movement in the 1960s and the feminist movement of the 1970s. Now, I'm setting the table for what we're going to do after break, but in August 1945, after the end of the war, VJ Day, or Victory in Japan Day, Truman is going to announce that the United States has emerged from this war the most powerful nation in the world, the most powerful nation perhaps in all of history. But you have to consider the looming Soviet Union, who, despite their profound human losses and physical destruction, had gained so much new territory, had built massive armed forces, and enhanced its international influence, making it the greatest power in Eurasia. So we will continue that after the break.